Throughout history, religions have offered us grand narratives as to the origins of the world, on how life began, on why we suffer, and what happens when we die. But what about the origins of religion itself? Why do nearly all human cultures, across time and geography, believe in gods, spirits, and unseen forces? Were these beliefs divinely revealed, or are they just a byproduct of our restless minds, shaped by evolution, psychology, and the need to make sense of an otherwise chaotic and unpredictable world? In this video, we'll be exploring the psychological roots of religion, how our brains are wired to seek patterns, detect agency, and tell stories, even when there might not be a valid story to be told. Did we create the gods to explain our world, or to soothe ourselves in the face of it? From our Hyperactive Agency Detection Device to the fear of death and our longing for meaning, this is the story not of the gods who made us, but of the minds that made them. Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Thibaut and I make videos on philosophy and science. Now, I know that I haven't been posting a lot lately. The summer season started a lot earlier than I was expecting, and I soon found myself working 60 hours a week, which doesn't leave me much time to make videos, obviously. However, I just handed in my resignation for one of the two jobs I was working at, and that should come into effect in the next few weeks. So in theory at least, I should have a lot more time to focus on releasing more content. I also wanted to start with a quick disclaimer here, as we are going to be looking at religion from a somewhat detached, analytical perspective. My goal here isn't to denigrate or criticize religion in any way. I'm just curious to understand why it is that so many people throughout history have in fact believed in gods and spirits. And with that out of the way, let's get back to the topic at hand. Religions come in all shapes and sizes. On the one hand, you have the widely practiced monotheistic branches, such as the three Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. On the other hand, you have polytheistic religions, such as Hinduism or the ancient religions of Mesopotamia and Central America. And then lastly, you have what we might refer to as animistic religions. Animism is most strongly associated with more ancient or so-called primitive societies. That isn't to say that animism is somehow inferior or perhaps even less evolved than other religions. Simply that if our goal is to explore the origins of religion, then animism is probably the best place for us to start. At its core, animism is the belief that natural objects, such as trees, animals, or even the wind, possess a spirit or conscious essence. In this worldview, the universe is not just material, it's alive. You can think of it as a kind of spiritual ecology, where every element of nature has its own individual agency, intention, or awareness. These kinds of beliefs are still practiced by indigenous cultures throughout the world today, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Arctic Circle. What's especially compelling about animism, however, is that it likely represents the earliest forms of religious thought. Before the gods even had names or temples devoted to their worship, our ancestors still related to the world around them as something that was alive, intentional, and responsive. In fact, I'd argue that all religions are animistic at heart. Whether you believe that the world is the manifestation of a singular divine entity or of many, either way what you believe is that it is imbued with spirit. The term animism itself actually derives from the Latin anima, meaning spirit, and this term evokes a notion of agency. If the wind rustles through the leaves, then perhaps it's because it meant to. And that's not just abstract theorizing. Where I live, near Lake Geneva, we still refer to our local winds by name, as if they were characters in a story. The Bise is a bitter, dry wind from the northeast, cold and cutting. The Föhn, by contrast, is warm and comforting. And the Bornand, most feared by our brave sailors on the lake, is unpredictable and stormy. Each of these winds has its own mood, its own personality, and even though most of us no longer believe in them as spirits, we still speak of them in animistic terms, as if they had intent, temperament, and presence. And I think that it is this proclivity of ours to attribute intentionality towards natural phenomena which holds the key to understanding the psychological roots of religion. So what is that driving factor behind our tendency to over-personify? Why do our minds create stories around these seemingly fictional characters? To answer that, we'll first need to peer into the very machinery of the mind, and how it's wired to see intention, even where there may be none to be found. Say you're a hunter-gatherer roaming in the savannah. You hear a rustling in the tall grass behind you. Probably just the wind, but what if it isn't? What if it's a predator lurking, or even an enemy preparing to attack? From an evolutionary perspective, would it be better for our minds to overestimate the potentiality of such a threat, or to underestimate it? This is the driving thought behind what evolutionary psychologists refer to as the Hyperactive Agency Detection Device, or HADD, a cognitive mechanism that developed to detect agency, even where there might be none to be found. This mechanism errs on the side of caution, flooding the world with potential minds, motives, and invisible actors. In a life or death situation, your brain doesn't really have time to calculate probabilities. It has to decide, react or relax. And from a survival standpoint, it's far safer to assume that there is something with intent behind that sound. Better to mistake the wind for a lion than a lion for the wind. And it might be a similar phenomenon that underlies our belief in supernatural entities too. In fact, we even refer to these beings as spirits. If an object suddenly moves in your kitchen, then you might feel a sudden chill run down your spine. Not because you've done the math, but because some deep part of your brain suspects that there's someone behind it. Not a gust of wind or a shift in balance, but a being with intent. This is HADD at work again, projecting agency into the unknown. And it doesn't stop with sounds or motion either. We also see faces in clouds, or Jesus in a slice of toast. This is a related phenomenon known as Pareidolia, the tendency to perceive familiar patterns, especially faces, where none actually exist. Together, HADD and Pareidolia prime our minds to see the world not as a neutral landscape, but as a stage populated with hidden actors, watching eyes and unseen forces. And it isn't hard to imagine how such tendencies could, over time, give rise to spirits, otherworldly entities, and eventually, gods. But these ideas alone aren't enough to explain why the belief in such spirits can persist over time. If you hear a noise coming from your kitchen, but explore it to find out that there was actually nothing there, then why would you maintain the idea that it was a spirit that caused it? It's important to understand here that we are not born into the world with a complete picture of all of its agents. Apart from a rare few exceptions, a human newborn will have no idea what kinds of creatures inhabit this strange world it is born into. These are concepts that we all have to develop and learn over time. Nobody is born with the idea of what a lion is. This is a model that we learn through exposure and experience. The fact is that when we hear a foreign noise but are unable to find a perceived agent to justify it, we have nonetheless developed a model of who that agent might be. For all intents and purposes, this supernatural agent is just as real as a dog or a cat. When the world offers us no answers, the mind creates its own, and sometimes those answers begin looking like gods. By themselves, HADD and Pareidolia cannot explain why certain mythologies persist. The reason why these ideas endure, at least in my opinion, is due to control and predictability. The world is a highly chaotic place. It is an ever-changing landscape, and there are oh so many things that we need to pay attention to. In order to avoid being overwhelmed by such an abundance of information, oftentimes we try to seek patterns, and ultimately predict and control certain elements of this otherwise unruly place. To bring this back to my local winds, if I know that the wind is going to be coming in from the north, then I can predict that it's going to be a bitterly cold winter's day. If on the other hand I know that it is coming in from the west, then I can only imagine that there's going to be a strong likelihood of rain. The fact that these winds have names is because it allows us to more easily associate with them certain recognizable patterns. Each spirit then has its own unique character and identity. And we do this all the time. If you're playing online poker, for example, then by the way that certain hands are played, you might begin recognizing a given player as a fish, and this might potentially allow you to more easily predict their patterns of behavior and how they might play next. A caveat to this, of course, is when we begin wrongly identifying certain patterns and motifs. A striking real-world example of this can be seen in the cargo cults of Melanesia. During and after World War II, isolated island communities encountered Western military personnel who arrived with enormous supplies of goods: food, medicine, tools, clothing, things that the islanders had never even seen before. These supplies, or cargo, seemed to descend from the sky, brought by aircraft and ships in ways that may have appeared magical to the locals. Once the war had ended and the soldiers had left, some islanders began reenacting some of the rituals that they had witnessed in the hopes that this might bring the cargo back. They began performing military drills, built mock airstrips and even control towers out of bamboo. From their perspective, these behaviours were associated with the arrival of the goods, and replicating them was a way of regaining control over the chaos of an unfamiliar world. The emergence of these cults was not irrational. It was a logical extension of the human tendency to identify patterns and create causal models, even when the information on which those models are based is limited or misunderstood. A similar demonstration of this can also be seen in a lot of Skinner's work. This pattern-seeking instinct has also been demonstrated in controlled experiments too. In the random pattern prediction task, participants were asked to predict the next item in a sequence where the outcomes were entirely random, say whether a light would appear on the left or right-hand side of a screen. Statistically speaking, the optimal strategy is to always choose the more frequent of the outcomes, a tactic known as maximizing. So for example, if the square is set to pop up around 70% of the time, then the optimal strategy would just be to always say square. But most of us don't do this. Instead, what most people do is to try and detect patterns amidst the noise, switching choices based on perceived sequences, a behavior known as matching. Despite the randomness, the mind searches for regularities, assuming that there must be some underlying structure there. The experiment shows just how deeply ingrained our tendency is to impose meaning on the world, even when there is none to be found. And it's not just isolated cultures or superstition either, it's a universal feature of our human cognition. And this tendency becomes even more pronounced when we feel like we've lost control. In a series of experiments by psychologists Jennifer Whitson and Adam Galinsky, participants who were made to feel powerless or uncertain were significantly more likely to perceive patterns in pure noise. These test subjects saw images in static, inferred conspiracies in random events, and even believed they could predict stock market trends from meaningless data. The researchers concluded that when our own individual sense of agency is threatened, the mind compensates by inventing order. In a chaotic world, the illusion of structure can feel like a form of control. And this idea ties very neatly with one of the most quintessential aspects of religious belief, our own personal relationship to death. Death is one of those rare case examples of things that we have almost no control over. And considering our psychology, it's only fair that we seek meaning in a situation that would otherwise leave us feeling utterly powerless. In the face of such absolute uncertainty, the promise of an afterlife, or even just the sense that death isn't the end, can offer us a profound sense of comfort and continuity. We didn't just create gods to explain the world, but perhaps also because our minds simply couldn't bear the idea of a world without them. I know that the tone of this video might have made it sound like I am somewhat anti-religion, but I do want to make it crystal clear here that I don't actually have any qualms with religion in principle. I think that quite easily we can be misled into believing that we are ourselves without belief, and oftentimes I think that this can lead to us developing a rather unhealthy sense of self-righteousness and hubris, and ultimately lead to us taking on some very moralizing and preachy standpoints in the name of rationality and truth. At the same time, I also believe that traditional wisdom can often offer us some very valuable lessons, and I think that even for an agnostic atheist such as myself, keeping an open mind and always being curious as to what other faiths might say is paramount. Increasingly so in our modern societies, we tend to view rationality as the greatest possible form of truth, and yet still we can remain blinded as to how much of our own personal beliefs both permeate and shape our realities. Lastly, I just think that maybe a life without faith might not even be a life worth living. For example, I myself am quite keen on the idea of one day being buried beneath a tree. There really isn't much rationale behind justifying such a will. I mean, you could just as easily plant a tree with regular fertilizer and potentially end up with the same net effect. And yet, somehow, the symbolism behind that action is something that I find quite appealing. I guess that what I'm trying to say here is that deep down we all believe in something, whether we have the words to describe it or not. It's just part of who we are, of our human condition. And so perhaps the real question here isn't whether or not we have faith, but what shape that faith takes on, what symbols, stories, or values we choose to orient ourselves around, consciously or otherwise. Because even if we do reject traditional religious structures, we still find ourselves drawn to meaning, to symbols that soothe us, to ideals that guide us, and to narratives that help us endure. Maybe we didn't find gods. Maybe we built them to fill the silence. I hope you enjoyed this video. I am working on a follow-up essay to this one on the cultural origins of religion, where I'll go over how organized religions in practice came to be. If you like this sort of content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I've been your host, Thibault, and until next time, stay curious.